Hey everyone, Dr. Jason Hedrick here. So today I want to give a short lecture about what is leadership, kind of the introduction to leadership. So um, hopefully by now you've gotten into some of the material. And one of the things that we commonly find in leadership studies is that there is no concrete definition to exactly what leadership is. And so, therefore, it makes it difficult for some to study, but also for others to really invest time in and believe in. And um, so I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about the history of leadership, and hopefully this will spur some great conversation and spur some questions from you. So I think that if we really begin to think about where leadership comes from, we have to look into ancient readings, ancient history, and so um, we can go all the way back to the 5th century and see that leadership was being written about and was being studied, which I think is so cool. Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, was a Chinese general and military strategist. And in The Art of War, basically that was about different tactics that could be used during military and war exercises. And it really became incorporated into state government systems. The central message of Sun Tzu was that the responsibility for a martial host of 1,000,000 men lies in one man. He is the trigger of the spirit. Um, I really enjoy Sun Tzu, and if you ever get a chance, check out some of his writings. The other one is Plato. Plato wrote the Republic back in 380 BC. And Plato was a Greek philosopher, as you probably know, and he warned against the rise of political leadership that was rooted in democracy, arguing that the electoral system encourages political leaders to pander to basic instincts of the mob, and indicated that he would elect that through this we would elect the most popular person rather than the most qualified candidate. Some would argue that Plato's writings from the Republic come true today. So again, something else to think about there. We can see Plato and Aristotle's rhetoric. We can see how the art of using speech to persuade is part of leadership. Machiavelli's The Prince, which was written in 1513. We can see that leadership was really, this was a commentary on his philosophy. And there's a quote from it: "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. And the end justifies the means." You've probably heard both those quotes before. And so those came from Machiavelli's The Prince, written in 1513. Modern leadership studies, you see on the board, I've got some words behind me, and we'll go into those a little bit more. And so I want to take you on a timeline about kind of what we've seen in leadership studies. So the first, if we start this conversation kind of around 1900, we see that the control and centralization of power. Basically, this belief was that leadership was typically in the hand of one person, and we focused on domination, and typically we thought of leaders as coming from a military setting. Next, as we get into the trait approach, we move from domination to influence. How do we influence others? And so the leader here, basically this belief, and we'll read about this in future weeks, but the belief here is that there are certain traits that make leaders. And if you don't have those traits, you're not a leader. Some people still prescribe to this today. I personally do not, but that is up to you, and you'll be able to answer that question in just a few weeks. Next, we have the group approach. And so the group approach, this is kind of 1940s type thinking. And in the group approach, leadership moved from being focused on the leader and those inborn traits to the behaviors of the leader and how they organize group activities. So we went to kind of group. This kept on throughout the 1950s. And so through the 50s, we see that this still focused on the leader. It looked at shared goals, which some people will still use today. When we talk about leadership, they'll talk about shared goals and united goals. And so from there, we move to kind of behavior. Really, that leader behavior, the way a leader behaves, makes him or her a leader. That was kind of the thoughts in the 1960s. Then we get more into organizational behavior. Organizational behavior in the 1970s said that the move kind of went from that behavioral approach to more an organizational approach. And we basically said that a leader's effectiveness is measured by organizational outcomes like profit, loss, productive employees, happy employees, those sort of things. As we kind of continue on the continuum, we see that in the 1980s that there was an explosion of research. See the explosion there? It's hard to record and walk at the same time. But with the explosion of research, that's when we really began processing and looking at leadership constraints. And so in the 1980s, research was the really big focus in leadership studies. We looked at the leader's will. Leadership is about getting followers to do what the leader wants. That was a big focus in the 1980s. Then as we kind of get through on from the 80s through the 90s and even into this century, leadership is looked at as a process. And so the process, whether that be authentic leadership, transformational, transactional, any of the different leadership styles that we're going to study this semester, the process really came on in the 90s and has continued on till today. Now, I can't tell you what the future of leadership holds, but maybe we'll uncover some things this semester that will allow us to examine that. So I wanted to take you on this continuum because I want you to understand that the focus and definition of leadership changes over time. And so as we have kind of developed and gone on to study leadership and conduct more research on kind of all of these things that have occurred over the timeline of leadership and kind of the focus and main points. I think one of the things you'll see is that every one of these ideas that I talked about on the timeline are still important today. And you'll see those reflected through the readings and reflected in the studies. And so we've really seen, I think, a more rational approach to how we look at leadership and how the leader responds rationally to a situation. Leadership is a transformational process. And when I say that, I mean that leaders can get followers to accomplish more than expected, and that we can also take a skills perspective on leadership. Leadership is effective by the virtue of developing knowledge and developing skills. And so throughout the semester, I hope that you see that there's not one approach that works for everyone in terms of leadership. When we look to employ leadership in student organizations, in our communities, in our own lives, through our organizations, we really have to examine what's going on at the time, and we have to see what works best for that situation, for that behavior, for certain skill sets that are held by leaders or by that organization. So this semester, I look forward to challenging the definition of leadership more, but I wanted to give you some background information before we got there.